Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters, to another installment of our special series highlighting the contributions, the historical contributions of Muslims of color, African Muslims, Muslims of African descent, and African American Muslims throughout history. And yesterday we started a two-part segment where we were talking about the impact of and influence of Muslims in spheres beyond religion and culture. And we talked broadly about their influence on politics, civilization, and military strategy, etc. And we said that today we were going to expand on the topic that we left off on, which was 700 years of African Muslim rule in Spain. And so that's what we intend to do today, to talk about the broad ways in which African Muslims, Muslims of color, influenced civilization, they influenced politics, they influenced culture and science and technology and all these other things on a worldwide scale. And so we want to talk about that today. And I'll begin by mentioning that a distinguished historian, Basil Davidson, he was speaking about the 8th century. And he recognized, when reflecting upon that period in history, in world history, he recognized and declared in one of his works, saying that there were no lands at that time, in the 8th century, more admired by its neighbors or more comfortable to live in than the rich African civilization which took shape in Spain. Now, Muslim Spain not only collected and perpetuated, as we mentioned, the intellectual advances of ancient Egypt, Greece, and the Roman civilization. It also expanded on that civilization and made its own vital contributions in fields ranging from astronomy, pharmacology, science and technology, architecture, agriculture, language, and law. And we're going to touch on, with some degree of breadth and depth, some of these contributions and some of these influences of Moorish Spain. So the first area we're going to focus on is science and technology. So the Moors, they introduced new scientific methods, and they introduced new scientific instruments to Europe. For example, the astrolabe is not something that they invented, but it is something that they brought to Europe, which was previously unknown to Europe, and is also something which they made improvements to make it more effective. The astrolabe is a device for measuring the position of stars and planets. They also were the leaders in scientific progress in astronomy, chemistry, physics, mathematics, geography, and philosophy. All of these sciences flourished under the Moors in Moorish Spain. As far as mathematics specifically is concerned, they brought the zero. They also brought Arabic numerals to Europe, which replaced the clumsy Roman system. And they also brought the decimal. And it is said by scholars and historians that this assisted the Europeans in solving problems far more quickly and accurately, and it laid the foundation for the scientific revolution. They also, beyond some of the sciences that we mentioned, they also had a particular curiosity and interest in aviation aeronautics. And perhaps some of you may have heard of Ibn Firnas, who was the son of North African parents. He was the person who was credited with making the first scientific attempt to fly in a controlled manner, and that was in the late 9th century. So we are talking at least 6 centuries before Leonardo da Vinci developed the hang glider. And so when we talk about flight, the father of flight, people will point to Leonardo da Vinci and they will totally ignore the fact that Ibn Farnas preceded him by 600 years, the son, as we said, of 2 North African parents. Let's go beyond aeronautics and aviation. The Spanish Moors also tried their hand at maritime navigation and seafaring. And it was, most of us have heard of or may have read about or studied in school about the great age of exploration, the great European age of exploration, where they embarked on these ships and they traveled around the world and they credited themselves with discovering parts of the world that were not previously discovered. But the reality of the matter is, it was the Moorish advances in navigational technology, such as we mentioned previously, the astrolabe and also the sextant, as well as their improvements in cartography and shipbuilding that paved the way for this age of exploration that the Europeans credit themselves with. Okay? And it is also important to point out that recent research shows that the African Muslims, the Moorish explorers, reached the Americas hundreds of years before Columbus. And Dr. Barry Fell of Harvard University, he mentions that there is an overwhelming body of new evidence which has emerged, which proves that Africans had frequently sailed across the Atlantic to the Americas and left a lasting impression on native culture. And among the evidence that is mentioned or that has been cited, is sculptures, oral traditions, coins, eyewitness reports, anecdotal evidence, ancient artifacts, Arabic documents, and inscriptions, indicative of the fact that somebody came there and spent time there and did some explorations there and interacted with the people well before Columbus. And it's important to ask the question, because we're all taught, our children are taught, we were taught, that Columbus discovered America. But one can only wonder how Columbus could have discovered America when a highly civilized and sophisticated people were watching him arrive from America's shores. They were on America's shores watching Columbus arrive, but he discovered America. Imagine if someone came to your house. Imagine if you came home from work one day and somebody was sitting on your couch watching your TV, and you were like, "What are you doing here?" It was a complete total stranger, and you said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I discovered your house. I've discovered this place, and I'm claiming it as mine." Right? But that's basically what Columbus did. People had been there before, and there was lots of indications and evidence that people had preceded Columbus, and among the evidence was statements from Columbus himself, as mentioned by Leo Wiener in the 1920 book that he wrote, Africa and the Discovery of America. He was a historian. Leo Wiener was a historian and linguist. And he wrote a book in 1920 called Africa and the Discovery of America, and explained how Columbus wrote in his notes when he arrived on the shores of America. He wrote that the Native Americans told him black-skinned people had come from the southeast in boats trading in gold-tipped spears. So long before Columbus arrived, black African Muslims came and had interacted with the people, and they left remnants and evidence to show that they had been there long before Columbus had arrived, in addition to the reports of the Indians, or the Native Americans, I should say, themselves. But let's talk about the influence of Moorish Spain on modernity, bringing the people of Europe, bringing progress to the people of Europe, bringing civilization, advancements in civilization, changing the lives of people with technological advancements that would, and technological and other advancements that would change their lives forever. Modernity. So one shining example of the modernity of Moorish Spain is the city of Cordoba. It was not just the capital of Moorish Spain, but was also the most important and modern city in Europe. They had a population of about 500,000 people. They had over 50 hospitals with running water, 500 mosques, and many libraries, one of which had over 500,000 manuscripts in one library. Now, this at a time when London had a predominantly illiterate population and had largely forgotten the technical advances of the Romans some 600 years before. Also, it's important to note about Cordoba that the streets were well paved with raised sidewalks for pedestrians. During the night, there were 10 miles of streets that were illuminated by lamps. And this is hundreds of years before paved streets appeared in Paris and street lamps in London. And Cordoba, it also had hundreds of public baths. And it is reported that poor Moors who were from the lower class in terms of their socioeconomic status, they would go without bread before they would go without soap. That basically cleanliness was something which was enjoyed, and it was something which was common for all people, rich and poor. And this is important because one of the things that history, revisionist history, has told us is that people of African descent, dark-skinned people, black people, for lack of a better word, are typically unclean and unkempt. And this is a clear indication that the Moors were anything but. It's also important to note that the Moors helped to lift the general European populace out of the Dark Ages and paved the way for the Renaissance period. In fact, many of the traits upon which modern Europe prides itself came to it from Muslim Spain. They were influenced to do a lot of these things that they did in terms of their law and in terms of their commerce. They were influenced by the example of Muslim Spain. And let me give you a few examples. Free trade, diplomacy, open borders, etiquette, advanced seafaring, research methods, and key advances in chemistry. Let's look at architecture. There are some distinct architectural features of Moorish Spain, which have left an impact. These architectural innovations of the Moors have left an impact and continue to influence architecture to this day. And among the things that they innovated, if you will, are those horseshoe, or what they're called Moorish arches. A lot of their buildings had those Moorish arches, interlacing arches, central courtyards, intricately carved woods and stucco, which were used to decorate buildings or decorate the inside of buildings, and also decorative tile work, which is something which is so common around the world. Who doesn't have in their bathroom? Who doesn't have behind their sink? That splash pad that's just beautiful tile that kind of beautifies any room and kind of brings the room together. Some masajid use these tiles now throughout the world. So where does this come from? It originated in Moorish Spain. They were the ones who were the first to use decorative tile work to beautify and decorate the inside of structures. Let's look at education and literacy. Education in Spain, Muslim Spain, Moorish Spain, was universal, meaning it was available to all. While in Christian Europe, 99% of the population was illiterate, and even kings could neither read nor write. The Moors, on the other hand, boasted a remarkably high literacy rate for a pre-modern society. They had across the territory, they had over 70 libraries. But if you look in other parts of Europe, they were almost non-existent. Libraries are almost non-existent. There were 17 universities in the Spanish territory occupied by the Moors versus 2 in the rest of Europe. And the founders of Oxford University, it's very important to point out, the founders of Oxford University were inspired to form their institution after visiting universities in Spain, in Moorish Spain. They visited Moorish Spain, and they were influenced, they were impacted by what they saw by the universities, and that inspired them to go back and to establish Oxford. Now, if you do I want to make a point here. If you do a search right now for the oldest existing universities or something like that, oldest existing universities, something to that effect, if you do a search for that, you'll find a list of universities, most of them traditionally Anglo-Saxon white Christian universities in places that are associated with Anglo-Saxon Christianity. So, for example, you'll find at the top of the list, you'll find the University of Bologna, Italy, which was established in the late 11th century. You'll find also on that list, close to the top, Oxford, which was established between the late 11th century and the late 12th century. And it was inspired by Moorish universities we just mentioned. You also have up on that list, high on that list, Cambridge, another university in the UK, established in the beginning of the 13th century. But you don't find any mention of the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, which was established in Morocco during the height of the Moorish Empire in 859 AD, 859 Christian era. We don't say AD, Christian era. And as of 859 Christian era, and it was founded by a black woman, an African sister by the name of Fatima al-Fihri. And this university is in reality, according to the United Nations education body, is in reality the oldest existing university. And it was established by the Moors, who also, in addition to occupying Spain and Portugal and parts of Italy and France, also occupied North Africa, Morocco. And so it was part of their territory, and it was a university established, and it still exists today. In fact, just to show you the injustice of this list that you'll find, a number of examples of it on the internet, is that even Al-Azhar, which is the famous university in Egypt, it was established in, I think, 970, which is still before all of the ones on this list that are mentioned toward the top of this list. Al-Azhar, 970. And so I say this to say that one of the problems that we suffer from, and I alluded to this yesterday, when it comes to the existing historical record, one of the problems that we face is this racial, ethnic, color-based bias and revisionist history. They tilt the history and the writing of history toward a certain racial or ethnic group to give the appearance to those who don't dig deeper that they are superior, and that all of the achievements and the advancements and the progress throughout history, the contributions to history, were done by that group. And this is a clear example of this because, as I said, even the United Nations education body recognizes that Al-Qarawiyyin is the oldest existing university. And even if you don't recognize that, even Al-Azhar, which is still existing, everybody knows it exists, it preceded all of the ones on their list. Preceded every last one. The one at the top of their list, University of Bologna, late 11th century. Al-Azhar, late 10th century. We're talking about actually more than a century, more than an entire century. But why? Because if we were to say Al-Qarawiyyin, if we were to say Al-Azhar in Egypt and another African country, then it doesn't jive with the narrative that we want to perpetuate, that the white Europeans, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, white Anglo-Saxon Christians have always been what? Have always been ahead of the curve, have always been the pioneers in everything. And so I just wanted to point that out. It's very important to point out that this is an example of what we're up against and why we need to do a better job ourselves of studying and learning and teaching our kids. Because this is part of the problem. What is happening is that an impression is being given to us and to our kids that people of brown and black and yellow and red skin have never done anything. They have never made any contributions to history, and therefore they deserve to be subordinate. That's the impression that they're given from an early age from the revisionist history that they're reading in school. طيب. ثم بعد ذلك, another sphere of influence of Moorish Spain was an influence in language, or their linguistic influence. And I'll just mention ala ujala that there are lots of words from the Arabic language that were introduced into Spanish and were introduced into English by the Moors. And some of those words are, they're almost unadulterated Arabic. And those are the words we find in our language which begin with the word with the letters L, A-L, al, right? With that syllable L, like algebra, and alcohol, and alkaline. These come directly from Arabic with just slight variations to kind of slightly anglicize them to make them easy for the English tongue to pronounce. But you also have many anglicized words that were altered. They were altered more drastically, but they still have or retain, I should say, some of their Arabic remnants. So, for example, chemistry comes from al-kimiyya in Arabic. Also, cipher, which comes from sifr, which is zero in Arabic, right? And nadir, which comes from nadir, which means counterpart in Arabic. And you also have other words which their origins are Arabic, but they have been anglicized to the extreme. So, for example, checkmate, influenza, typhoon, orange, and cable all have Arabic origins. And so the Moors brought this, this tremendous Arabic influence to the Spanish language as well as the English language. طيب. It's also important, a couple last things I want to note really quickly before we close, is that the Moors and Moorish Spain was basically a landline, a lifeline to Europe to pull them out of the Dark Ages. And we know that the Dark Ages basically are that time, basically where it said that the progress and the advancement of civilization for a period of time grinded to a halt and became idle. And people just kind of stagnated and did not grow. And civilization didn't grow and advance and progress for several centuries, right? This may have been the case for Europe. It was not the case for Africans, as we have seen from some of the examples we've given about Moorish Spain. But I'd like to give a few more examples, and I'll quote the renowned historian Sheikh Abd'Llah, who explains how during the Middle Ages, the great empires of the world were black empires, and the educational and cultural centers of the world were predominantly African. Moreover, during that period, it was the Europeans who were the lawless barbarians. The Moors eventually ruled over Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and southern France for over 700 years. He goes on to say, although generations of Spanish rulers have tried to expunge this era from the historical record, recent archaeology and scholarship now sheds new light on how Moorish advances in mathematics, astronomy, art, and philosophy helped propel Europe out of the Dark Ages and into the Renaissance. The last area that I want to mention of Moorish African Muslim influence is the area of agriculture. The Moors introduced many new crops, including the orange, lemon, peach, apricot, fig, sugarcane, dates, ginger, and pomegranate, as well as saffron, cotton, silk, and rice, all brought to Europe and beyond Europe by African Muslims ruling over Moorish Spain and bringing this part of civilization, this expansion of civilization in the form of agriculture to greater Europe. And with that, brothers and sisters, we will bring today's session to a close. It's again another opportunity that we have been given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to learn about the contributions of Muslims of color African Muslims, Muslims of African descent, and African American Muslims, and hopefully we'll get a chance before we run out of time in this month to talk about some of the African American Muslims who've contributed as well to history. But the important thing is that these classes that we've had have given us an opportunity, hopefully opened our eyes to see that there is so much more out there that we can learn about these people of color who share our faith and who have done so much that unfortunately the history books have omitted. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn about them and benefit from learning about them. Benefit as individuals, benefit as families, benefit as communities. Change our perspective. Change the way that we look at others who don't look like us. People with dark skin, people from the African continent, etc. And with that, brothers and sisters, we'll bring today's session to a close. Hopefully, inshallah ta'ala, Saturday, I'll have a good treat for you, because Saturday is likely to be our last session in this series. But until then, brothers and sisters, as always, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless your houses, to bless your spouses, to bless you and to make you blessed wherever you may be. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who listen to the talk and follow the best of it. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who He teaches beneficial knowledge, and who He allows to truly benefit from that knowledge by making us from those who put into practice. Hada wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Nabi Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.